Good morning again, everyone. Please allow me to thank you all for joining us today. Sorry, before that, let me open my camera so you can see me. Yes. Good morning, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar. We're excited to welcome you, and thank you for taking your time to join us. So today we'll be focusing on knowledge in organizations. So today, our speaker is Mr. Wynand van der Walt, who is the Senior Manager for Innovation Systems and Collections at Rhodes University Library. Mr. van der Walt holds a master's degree in IT from the University of Pretoria. His areas of interest are leadership for innovation, digitization, and digital curation, scholarly communication, indigenous knowledge system, and ontological frameworks within the semantic web and how it affects information-related technologies. So without wasting any more time, please let's welcome Mr. Wynand van der Walt. Thank you. You may go ahead.
Thank you, Pretty. Thank you. Can you all see my slides?
Yes, we can see them.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And this is actually quite a privilege. I've looked through the names of attendees, and it feels like I'm talking to my superiors, not my just colleagues. I think a lot of you know more than I do about a number of topics. What I'm going to speak to you about today is taxonomy specifically, and the presentation builds on something I did previously. So those of you who attended the University of Pretoria presentation last year would recognize some of the slides, although I've expanded and changed some of them quite considerably. But the idea of today is to create an awareness and to plead to IGBIS to follow a certain route, to be the leaders in how we change and how we reflect our metadata and obviously our collections subsequently to this. The abstract I'm not going to read, but it's really about addressing taxonomies that we employ in our daily work and how we then perceive the world. And before we start talking about ontologies, I just want to go to something that for me has always been a very profound statement, and that is that we have created the world and how we view the world and how we do things, but we cannot change, we cannot amend, we cannot adapt, and we cannot correct if we still have the same understanding. We have to see the world anew, and that's what I'm asking you today, is to take a step back from your normal understanding of what you do on a daily basis and reflect on the world in a broader sense, specifically when it comes to epistemology. So where do we start? And I realized most of us, if not all of us, were trained on how to apply certain tools within our the course of our work. We were asked to use certain tools, and we never questioned tools. We were asked to follow a certain process, and we applied the process stringently. And I mean, on this group, we've got some of the best catalogers that I've seen, metadata specialists. But during our studies and during much of our time as practitioners, we've never actually focused on questioning the very tools that we use. And as knowledge workers, we obviously work within the knowledge domain, and we apply a lot of organizational tools. And part of this taxonomies and the ontologies which we uphold through our daily work. But we have to realize something, and that is that when it comes to Africanization, and you would hear me talk about Africanization and not decolonization, I prefer the term Africanization for a number of reasons, which is beyond this call. We have to consider the presence of African-related material And now I'm talking about the broader sense, like in a GLAM environment, for instance, the materials beyond just what we have in our libraries, but what we have in our archives, what we have in our museums, galleries, our gardens, as the case is with the University of Victoria, for instance, and their GLAM environment, and beyond in our daily practices as humans. Um, and part of this Africanization is that we have to establish a presence. We cannot expect the eradication of everything else without coming up with an alternative presence. And this is what today is really about. So we know the tools that we apply is, I mean, everything we do, it is Library of Congress, the list goes on. The tools that we apply, specifically the taxonomies that we apply, is Western centric. It holds and upholds and perpetuates the colonial worldviews. And I'm just giving you one example, looking at the 200s. 200s being religion. Now, this is the Dewey system, for those of you who would recognize it. And it's still horrifying to me to see that you've got Christianity as being 200 to 289. And all the other religions, the thousands of religions beyond Christianity, is stuck between 290 and 299. And one has to think about, but all right, but whose views are we perpetuating? And I'm not saying Christianity is wrong. I'm just saying this is an example, right? Whose belief is prominent in these taxonomies, and which beliefs, which practices are put into the border or the sideline through the very tools that we use. So this is just one example, but this is, for me, was one of the most horrific examples. And especially in an era where you have a lot of other cultures and religions. We talk about multiculturalism, we talk about our differences, we talk about diversity, etc. But the tools do not talk about any of this in reality. And I know there's attempts to address this, but it's slow, first of all. And secondly, I do not think it's very effective at times, but I might be wrong. All right. So quite often when we work with Africanization or sorry, within Africanization field, and we work with African materials, there's a misfit when it comes to certain things, which I will address as we go through this process. So first of all, where do we start? I want you to take a step back, and I want you to ask yourself, what is my worldview? Have I considered an alternative to what I think is that which I believe is to be the truth or to be the knowledge domain in which I function? So, for instance, consider our collections as representing our worldview. And then I have to ask, well, who's our? Because if our metadata tools, etc., that we apply is Western centric, it means that our whole collection development, all our service, etc., everything is actually dictated to from a Western perspective. So what do our collections and our metadata practices say about understanding of how knowledge is created and generally accepted? Now, how knowledge is created and generally accepted, apologies, I'm unfortunately ill at this point. How knowledge is created actually implies, what do we believe to be the truth? How do we know what we know? How do we organize that which we know, and how do we classify what we know? So we have to really, do a lot of introspection and consider how we understand the world and through whose lens are we looking at the world. So now taking that to a more scientific, or at least from a metaphysics viewpoint, you then have to ask the question, all right, from an epistemological view, how do we know what we know? Ontological viewpoint would be, what do we believe exists? That also means, what do we believe that don't exist in reality? Taxonomic viewpoint is, how do we organize what we know? And this, you'll see the three of these throughout this presentation will come out quite strongly. Epistemology informs both ontology and taxonomy, with ontology shaping taxonomy. And the base representation of, so ontology is the base representation of the relationships between concepts and the validity of said concepts. First of all, you have to add validity to the concepts because that is what you believe. But there's also the relation between these concepts. And then based on the relationship between these concepts, we then apply a hierarchy to it, meaning that we then organize the knowledge. So inadvertently, we are knowledge architects, but we've never questioned the building which we are building. So we have to rethink our understanding of knowledge and how we actively perpetuate the Western bias. And we have to start thinking about our practices from an African-centric position. All right, here's one example. I've shown you religion earlier on. What happens if I were to say, well, let's look at the world from an African perspective? Let's take religion. And immediately now I've applied the very same Dewey structure, more or less, but I've rewritten it from an African perspective. Saying, right, yes, you've got general religious studies, 2 to 10, and this is just an example of what can be done, right? African, apologies.
Bye.
Should I Sorry, is somebody asking a question or should I continue?
You can continue.
All right, thank you. So if I were to change everything and say, look, let's look at the world from an African perspective, and specifically now taking religion as a key focus area, then I can look at African traditional beliefs or religions, and first of all, looking at the concepts of divinity and spirituality, rituals and practices, oral traditions, mythologies, etc. Because one cannot apply the same kind of belief system that you would get from a Western perspective into an African environment and say, well, structure which you do not find in your normal Western environments. And the list goes on. So this is just one example of how I'm trying to flip the structures and see things from an African perspective. I'm not saying we should apply this. I'm just saying that this is an example of how I played with things to see, well, if I were to look at it differently, what would happen? I'm fortunately not alone in this. Quite recently, I think, yeah, this was May 2025, this year, this library in New Zealand replaced Dewey with a system rooted in Maori tradition. And this is actually exactly what I'm talking about. And I'm not saying that we should throw out Dewey. I'm not saying we should throw out Library of Congress. I'm saying that they've actually gone beyond just thinking about it. They've come up with a different system. They're still testing it to see how effective it is, but it's not losing its value or visibility because of the semantic environment in which we function. And that is an important step to note. I'm not going to touch on the semantic web today. That's another aspect to this, but it allows you to have different taxonomies that's linked through upper ontologies. And I'll show you one of the upper ontologies as we go through the presentation. But this is great. I mean, this is one example of where people say, sorry, the Dewey is not working for us. We are going to change. All right. Apologies. This is just continuing from the religion perspective, and I've actually added to this. This is just an example, including comparative religions. So what I'm saying is that when Dewey was created as one of the examples, there was a specific worldview held by Dewey, but we've never questioned it. We try to adapt the structure instead of asking whether the structure is currently working for us or not. And the list continues. All right. So let's focus a bit on examples. Here's another example where I took, those of you know cataloging, I took the 960, specifically 968, and I said, I'm going to change this completely. Now, I'm not talking about from an African perspective, but in this case, I thought, well, let me look at it from an Amakosa perspective. So, well, how would it look from their perspective, our history, our shared history? And it was quite interesting to see certain things come out. In our and Chantal knows this. I keep on going on about, the fact that South Africa didn't exist before, 1911, 10. Why is our, our ontologies talking about certain things as if that was the only thing that existed, whether it's the Cape of Good Hope, etc. Nobody says something like Mashonaland, Matabeleland, etc. Whatever the original names were. I don't know the real names of the regions. But there's an example where I flipped it again. I said, write about South African history, and specifically the frontier history. The frontier is the area in which we work. So Grahamstown is part of this frontier area, and rewrite it, but from the Amakosa perspective. And there you see, for instance, 968 400 Umhlaba Winshaba, enemy's land. Discusses the Cape Colony settlers as Inshaba, meaning enemies. The only reason I'm doing all of this is to get different perspectives on things. I'm not saying we should apply it again. I'm just saying that we will not be able to Africanize if we do not question the taxonomies that we work with. And also, we will not be able to Africanize and create an African presence on the internet if we do not focus on alternative histories or parallel histories which are reflected in our taxonomies. So, practical steps. Epistemologists, we should look at critical studies and theories of knowledge, looking at the validity, the contextual relevance, the methods and scope of epistemology. We also have to become active knowledge architects, and I'm going to talk a bit more about this going further down, where we have to, I use the term decolonize the internet, but it's really about creating an African presence on the internet. If you want, I don't know how many of you are actively involved in ensuring that information from an African perspective is actually available on the internet. Now, a lot of us are currently working with AI tools, for instance, and the AI tools, sorry, just a second. Thank you. Sorry, I just got some water. Thank you. Apologies. I was fine yesterday, and today I'm not. Things happen. I think it's the winters in this area. It's actually terribly cold one day, and the next it's like 35 degrees or something. Right. As active knowledge architects, we have to decolonize the internet, meaning that we have to create an African presence on the internet. The only way we can do it is to create the data that's fed into the internet through various means. I mean, one example would be, for instance, Sabinet's archival documentation, for instance, or our own repositories. Those are all fed into the internet in many ways. It becomes a key cornerstone in the large language models used for AI. But more is needed, and some of the work needs to be done on a higher level. I've spoken about upper ontologies, where you have your Wikimedia projects, Wikipedia, for instance, linked data, and alternative taxonomies that we have to consider. All right, wrong way. Another example, at Rhodes, we're busy with the Environmental Learning Resource Center, where they've asked us to assist with developing a controlled vocabulary, which is actually just a taxonomy. Now, taxonomy is just general use in a specific area or region or subject that people are acquainted with the terminology. And this taxonomy needs to be established as a taxonomy. Therefore, it needs to be structured, it needs to be agreed to, and it needs to be published on the internet so that you can link to it. But we are working on this. So we're looking at integration of taxonomic ontology into ERC's knowledge management system. We have to publish it eventually with unique identifiers. We have to link these published terms to Wikidata entries, and we also have to create Wikidata entries where needed. But however, this is still from a subject perspective and not from a cultural or alternative perspective. All right. Here's another example which baffled me. This is a plant specimen. I'm not going to pronounce the plant's name, like exfoliatum something. I'm not good with this. But what struck me is that vernacular plant names is normally put in either notes or keywords, but it's not. There's no structure for the plant names. Um, um, right, can you all hear me again?
Yes, now you are back. We can hear you.
Right. I don't know where you stopped hearing me, but I was talking about this plant specimen, and I think that's where something happened. Um, the plant names in both Amundo and Sun is cleared keywords because I couldn't find a taxonomy in either of those languages that one would use as you would, for instance, where you've got the subjects on top, which is based on, I think in this case, it was 2 or 3 specific taxonomies that we've blended into a subject field. One being, I think, Library of Congress. The other one was a plant-specific taxonomy, which I can't recall at this point what it was. But this is just one example of how hidden Africa Africa is actually, not just in our practices, but I mean, if you look at this metadata itself, it's so hidden and it's not linked to anything. And that's one of the reasons why we argue for the decolonization of the internet, is to increase the presence of forms. Can you all see the photo?
Yeah. Yes.
All right. Can I ask, I mean, I don't know if there's a chat box or something, but what is significant about this photo that somebody can pick up? And there's no wrong to this. I mean, this is I'm exploring an option here. Don't know if anybody's willing to type into the chat box.
Somebody has said tribal dress, maybe, and someone else said young Zulus is one thing that's wrong.
Yes. Yeah. All right. Those are 2 very important factors. However, we can't get away from the young Zulus. That's the title of this item. And that's how we've created the metadata. But what is of incredible value that is nowhere on the metadata of this photo, it's the beadwork. So whoever said the traditional dress, absolutely right. But in order to put this into the metadata, one has to then ask, what's my perspective? What am I actually describing? It's a stunning photo. I absolutely love this photo of the little ones and their faces. Um, but it's one of the few photos where you can see, like somebody put it, a traditional dress, but the beadwork, and I don't know if there's any person who understands the Zulu culture that's on this group that can tell us more about the beadwork itself. But if you know Zulu beadwork, you would know that there's significance placed on color, where it's worn, things like that. So somebody who would like to say, yes. All right, somebody trying to say something or not? All right. Stunning photo. But now look at the metadata, and neither Chantal or I can take responsibility for this metadata. And I know it's wrong. I just want to show you how absolutely missing key factors regarding our heritage is just not visible to anybody out there. Subject, Zulu, African people. Now I've got a problem immediately, and Chantal knows this. I don't know, Chantal, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but do we find something like German, European people?
No.
Yeah. So again, this is another example of how we are forced into boxes from a Western perspective. A Westerner would not consider, they have to define certain things, but they've got to tell the world that, remember, the Zulu is an African people. Sorry, I've got a major problem with this. But the fact that the only subject heading in this case was Zulu African people in itself is problematic, because what's more valuable on this photo is actually the beadwork and not the people, because we don't know anything about the people. We can run AI tools to date the photo, or at least give an estimate of the date of the photo. But if you look at this metadata record, there's really nothing to this record that shouts of respect, that shouts of honor in what we do. So I'm really disappointed in this one specifically, and it needs a lot of work. I think a lot of our materials are actually like this, and it was this word Young Zulus, and Nicholas is right. That was, I think this was probably Corey, Sir George Corey, who took a photo and then just wrote on the photo Young Zulus, or something like that. Right. No, it wouldn't be George Corey. There's no author here. But notwithstanding, the point is taken. All right. So now I've already now spoken about the epistemology, I've spoken about ontology to some extent, but now I want to go back and say, all right, we also have to remember that taxonomies are context dependent, and this is very important. Now, our typical approach would have been, let's grab the Library of Congress subject headings, let's grab the DDC, and let's look at what happens. Now, I look at beadwork specifically, and I'm not a cataloger full time. I can promise you my catalog gets checked by Suzanne, Chantal, and Batiswa, because I don't do this all the time, and it needs to be checked. But the Library of Congress subject heading in this case would be beadwork, South Africa, KwaZulu-Natal, Zulu African people, material culture or decoration ornament Zulu. These are some of it. There might be others ones as well. DDC, something like personal adornment, beadwork, and you combine it with either geographical or, like in this case, history of Southern Africa. I'm not saying this is correct, but this is what we would have done. I want you to reflect a moment on what you see in front of you and ask yourself, really, does this really speak to this item? And what we really want to say, where's the I don't know how to put this, but there's something missing, and it's intrinsic to the culture, in this case, the Zulu culture, that's not being expressed in any of these taxonomies that we have in front of us. Something that will add a value of pride. If you think about what people like Steve Biko, etc., said, an identity. And there's an identity for us missing in these taxonomies. Identity in terms of who we are as people, as Africans, as South Africans, as in this case Zulu, etc. And that's just not visible. And we need to change this. Well, then the question is, if this is a typical approach and we want to do away with the typical approach, what would the options be? Well, let's first go back. Sorry, I've got this extra slide. This DDC and Library of Congress subject headings, you would immediately see it's Eurocentric, Western focused, and it's less suited to express indigenous meaning systems, symbolism, and epistemologies in beadwork alone, never mind the rest. There might be a reason why those four children were together. And there might be other things I don't know because unfortunately, I'm not 100% informed of Zulu culture. So I might miss some things on that photo that somebody else who's more familiar with the culture would notice. But I just focused on the beadwork because I felt that is missing. And you'll see later on why I focus on the beadwork. Apologies. All right, now if these are not working for us, what do we do? What are the options? Well, it largely depends on your context. And the context is also important because I want to ask all of you to reconsider your context. The context being is where you're writing from and who you're writing for and who you're writing about. All right. One of the options would have been the AIT, beadwork as an object genre. We have a broader term, decorative arts. You've got related terms, beads, body ornamentation, etc. Indigenous art, Zulu, African culture. Again, it's expressed. Again, I have a problem with that. And you can also hardly specify Zulu beadwork. You can use faceted classification, combining it with like culture, technique, material, or function. Now, what is nice about museum and cultural heritage context is that it's good for nuanced, multicultural, and visual classification systems in museums and cultural databases, like those of the Smithsonian British Museum, Cornell Library, for instance, or other entities in South Africa. So this is very good to consider. All right, but what about other alternatives? Well, I think this is the route I'm actually arguing for, where for the purpose of Africanization and also the purposes of representation of indigenous knowledge systems, that we have to develop local ontologies or taxonomies. In this case, looking at the Nguni or the Zulu ontological models, emphasizing symbolic function, gender and age roles, ritual significance, regional styles, like there's a difference between Msinga and Ngoma, etc. So how would you go about doing this? Well, first of all, you have to look at the Nguni speaking community taxonomy projects, meaning engage with the community because it's their environment, it's their context. And here I am as an outsider trying to describe a cultural aspect of a group that I have very little knowledge about, using taxonomies that was never ever meant for this environment. So you have to engage with the communities. That's what we've done with the LRC, is where Chantal would sit with the subject owners, or subject specialists rather, and come up with an ontology that they can agree to, including what is already in taxonomies, and whether the understanding of the terms in the taxonomies are what they agree with, and where they differ, what's the alternatives. Another option, the colonial knowledge ontologies that we have to design. Also looking at custom Tasari. That's exactly what we're actually doing. And this is based for authentic representation. Now, going back, so you have your still Western ontologies, or taxonomies rather, that's based for nuanced multicultural and visual classification systems. However, this is based for authentic representation, meaning you want to represent the truth. Just going back to epistemology, how do we know what we know? And how do we know it's the truth? One can also argue, if something is not visible, if something is not expressed, does it exist? And that's the problem with Africanization and decolonial conversations, that if it doesn't exist, or if it's not expressed, it doesn't exist. So we have to look at what's the option to establish to ensure there's not just representation. So you first have to have the presence, the representation, but the authentic part of it is critical. It's got to be absolutely correct. So I've been talking for 40 minutes. Now I'm getting to a point where I'm going to ask, what can IGBIS do? And this is a plea to IGBIS. Please identify appropriate taxonomies for different works. All right. What I'm saying is, can we please try to move away from Western ontologies, or Western taxonomies rather? Can we identify and apply taxonomies that's subject specific in order of preference? For instance, we have a preference when it comes to name authorities, where we say, well, first of all, we will use OCLC, the personal name, as an authority option. If not, then we would use VIAF. If not VIAF, then we would use ORC-ID. And the list goes on. I'm really sorry about all this coughing. I don't know what's gone into me. I was fine yesterday. We have to work with local communities. And this is another plea to IGBIS, is to help us establish these projects where we can work with local communities and taxonomists and linguists, etc., to co-develop localized taxonomies. We also have to always consider the context as part of the approach to cataloging. We have always been told you catalog so that people find the books in your library. And I think that's most probably one of the biggest myths at this point in time. I think it's absolutely wrong. And we also have to work with Wikimedians to develop presence on wiki projects such as Wikidata. And I will show you an example soon before I get to the conclusion. Well, maybe I should first finish the conclusion, then I can go into Wikidata. So in summary, epistemology, ontology, and taxonomy are interconnected concepts. They collectively influence how knowledge is understood, organized, and represented. And I think the one word missing here is how knowledge is actually experienced. And if we talk about lived experiences, can you imagine your identity being eradicated by the very presence of the knowledge structures that deny your existence, just because it's either a forced perception or it's an unrepresented perception? Epistemic beliefs inform ontological structures, which in turn shape taxonomies. That's understood. We understand that these links is crucial for developing inclusive and cultural sensitive approaches to knowledge organization, and especially in diverse contexts. And we can only optimally decolonize collections by starting with epistemological changes. If we don't change our thinking and our understanding of the world, we will perpetuate the very challenge that we're currently experiencing in the world in many places, but specifically in Africa. So that's one part of it. And I just want to go and show you the Wikidata element here. All right, can you see the Wikidata entry?
Yes, we can.
Great. There's a couple of things that I've picked up. First of all, I went to look at the word for beading in Zulu, which I found. But interesting enough, Wikidata as an upper ontology has got a language limitation, meaning that because certain languages are not prominently embedded into the upper ontology, it means that you cannot actually see it, they become invisible. So in this case, the word beading, you'll find in so many languages. English, this morning I did the Afrikaans word here, krallenwerk, Dutch, Arabic, the list goes on. There it goes up to Chinese, different types of Chinese, Ukrainian, Turkish, the list goes on, except, can somebody show me one single African language represented here? So even ontologies are limited by certain things. And part of our work as metadata specialists is we'll have to reach out. We'll have to inform these upper ontologies as well. Now, to put it in plain English, an upper ontology is basically an umbrella ontology, meaning it links multiple ontologies. So if I were to create, in this case, I'm just going to scroll down. If I were to create a localized taxonomy in whatever language, but it clearly expresses the kind of cultural aspect of the beadwork, then I can add it, I can build in the identifier in Wikidata. And as an upper ontology, this Q number, Q2915129, will then be in a semantic environment discoverable through all the other taxonomies that's listed here. And here you have the art and architecture thesaurus ID. So in your linked data elements, you then have the option to use this, or preferably you would use the upper ontology identifier. There we have ACS Leiden, Australian, BBC, the list goes on. You can see all of those taxonomies coming through. There's about 1,700 taxonomies in total. But we have to establish localized taxonomies. So we don't have to necessarily correct what's already out there. Personally, I think it's a great initiative, but I do not think that we will be successful in wanting to change the Library of Congress or wanting to change Dewey, etc., because you are challenging the belief system that was created by Westerners for Westerners to interpret the world for, as they see the world. We are arguing for them to see the world differently. That won't happen. You might get one or two things that they will change, but we will not. If anybody has experiences with Americans alone, it's impossible to change their thinking about what is important to them. Not a study. So we have to create taxonomies, localized taxonomies. We have to identify subject-specific taxonomies that we can use as well. And this is one great way of doing it. You can see, for instance, like in art and architecture. Let me just go through. Let me just click on this, the identifier. It should take me through to the art and architecture thesaurus in this case. Something is happening. It's just taking a bit of time. But the point is rather establish, and we're not competing. We are asking for an African presence. An African not being holistic. I'm definitely not one of the people that believe Africa is a single country. We have to focus on all aspects of diversity in our regions, in our areas, and each should have its place, its presence in these taxonomies. Sorry, this is really taking a long time to open, and I'm not sure why. Apologies. So let's go back to the presentation. There you have it. I hope it's been informative. I hope it's been, I hope it's been challenging. I think that's rather what I would like to ask. I really want IGBIS to lead us in changing things, follow the route that Maori Library, for instance, has done. And so we will stop using knowledge domains that do not represent our understanding of the world, how we see the world and how we see ourselves. Because as long as we are told how to see ourselves, we will never fully have our own identity. So thank you.
Thank you, Bainant, for that very informative presentation. Colleagues, if there are any questions, please come up. There we've got one in the chat from Marika Bayer. Would the idea be to implement inclusive metadata from a certain point onwards, or how do we deal with our collection data as is? Do we have to reclassify all previous items historically?
Well, personally, I believe that we have to, like the one image that I showed you of the young Zulus, is that we have to constantly go back and reflect. Fortunately, a lot of the mechanisms like ALMA, like Sierra, etc., can allow you to update things automatically, or at least apply changes across a range of objects. But one of the other things which I have not mentioned is our consistent use of this taxonomies across platforms. Now, I know Chantal would use Library of Congress on Sierra, and then I would come along and do something else, for instance, on the repository, and we would create, I can't remember, Chantal, there was one we even created, and we said, well, from now on, we're going to use this, that's Afrikaans. COPS.
COPS.
Yes. So this is an example of where we decided at one point, we're not going to use the term, it was specifically for a what is believed to be the regional Afrikaans, meaning Afrikaans stems from COPS and not the other way around. And we had to go back and we had to correct our previous records. So that's just one example. So we have to constantly go back. Afrikaans actually, interesting. But this is again, it's we have to work with the linguists, we have to work with the taxonomists, etc., and get a full understanding of our environment. But to answer your question, yes, we have to address it. We have to go back at one stage, but nothing stops us from identifying the taxonomies that we can apply immediately and start using those as a start, and then go back eventually.
Thank you. We've got a hand from Dion Skitter. You'd like to come in?
Hi, good morning, colleagues. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Wynand. Long time no see, but good to meet you here. So in 2023, Wynand, a lady with the name of Violet Fox, who was then an editor for the Dewey group in OCLC, reached out to us and had a lovely presentation here, in which she really advocated for IGBIS and the people belonging here to form a group to address deficiencies and incorrect data that is hosted at either LOC or Dewey or even the Sears subject headings. And I think that what should have been done is that we should have set up like a subcommittee or something at that stage where people could start working together to identify these issues, and then also to take these issues forward to the LOC, to Dewey, to Sears. I am the representative, the African representative for the Dewey EPC, and we had our annual our 6-monthly meeting last week, and I can tell you now that the EPC is very keen to change terminology that's incorrect or that is offensive in Dewey. And the issue so nicely highlighted about religion, especially in the 200s, is being looked at because people are far more open to changes and to adapt for the current environment in which we are. And this would also filter through to not only religion, but also to culture, geography, as well as things like sexual orientation or sexual status. So there's work being done out there, and people are really open to changing things, but we need people to stick together and to get together to send these things forward to these committees so that the changes can actually happen. Thank you.
Yes. I think that is, I know about the work that's already done, and I think it's a good step in the right direction. I'm not sure about the representativeness, however. That's a question I have, because if we want to change things, we actually have to go to a cultural level, and we have to look at it from an indigenous knowledge perspective to really be able to express certain things. I mean, one of the most famous incidents I had, we were sitting in Germany, and one of my counterparts in Nairobi, Lagos, stood up and he drew a tree, and he asked the people, "What do you see?" The Germans. And I said, "We see a tree." And he said, "No, I see the center of my community." And that is an incredible shift. And And to date, I do not think the Germans actually really understand, because it's not part of their experience at all. So it's going to be very difficult to change in my view, to change the taxonomies and ontologies that's already out there. One can, I agree, one could correct certain things, etc. But will it really be representative of a community, of a region? And that's always been my question, because can you imagine, how do you take Dewey and you fit like a Russian perspective and a Zulu perspective and a Inuit perspective into the same thing? That's like trying to align, and they're not. They can't, because the diversity is just too wide. So I'm not sure how we're going to address it, but I'm aware of the work you've done, and I'm really pleased. And I've recently joined, I think, what's the funnel? Supposed to go to meetings. I just haven't had time yet. So thank you, Dion, for your input as well.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Any other questions? There's nothing in the chat, nothing new.
I think what I would really like to see is that ICBIS comes up with the list of taxonomies in certain disciplines and to identify where the gaps are, where things do not speak to a South African or indigenous context, and if we start from there, looking at what's not there and how do we go about fixing those things? How do we work collectively? And I agree with what Dion said, is that we have to unite, and it has to be something that's not an option. It should be enforced, in my view. We're really serious about Africanization, decolonization. Certain things need to be mandatory.
Okay. Thank you again. And if there are no further questions, I'll hand over to Tola for the closing.
Thank you, Chantal, and good morning, colleagues. Okay. Thank you very much, Vainand, for sharing the recognizable adverse impacts on challenges posed by the taxonomies and ontologies are applicable to our practice. And I just want to say that the ICBIS do take note of the posed challenge of, intervention in coordinating the transformational change of inclusivity in approach in trying to mitigate, the challenges that are before our community of practice. The ICBIS will therefore look into the challenge, also deliberate on it, and again, also, act on it with relevant stakeholders. We hope to, present the possible mitigating factor case and with new thought processes as, collaborations have been, also presented before us. Once again, thank you, colleagues, for making time to attend the ICBIS webinar. And please try to keep warm and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.